What's up, gangsters? Let's do episode 4 of the Tamiya Spitfire fundamental build. Now, this one is going to be a little bit long. It's like an hour, and I'm not even going to apologize because it turned into what I think is a pretty important episode. So, let's just get right into it. Okay, so we are back in business, and I was getting ready to set up to shoot some color on these parts. And then something occurred to me, and that is that some of you guys may feel compelled to fill in this joint right here where we assembled the two pieces of the each fuselage half. And that's not, that's not invalid. When you put the two halves of the fuselage together, you'll see that you can kind of see that down in there. I mean, you're not going to be able to without, good light. And of course, when it's black in there, you're not going to be able to see it. But at a certain angle, it would be visible. And so that's not a bad idea to fill that in. And it presents us with a filler problem that, quite honestly, we're not going to see anywhere else on this kit because we're just not going to need to do much of that kind of work. We certainly aren't going to have any gaps like that. So I thought, well, it's worth using this as a way to talk about how to decide how to do filler, how to decide what filler to use, etc. So I've got a pretty comprehensive video on fillers, but it's been a while since I made it, and I want to sort of distill that thing down to something that hopefully is a little bit more useful. So when you've got a problem like this, you've got to decide what kind of filler to use, obviously. And I have a kind of a little decision tree that I go through. Trust me, I don't write it out on a sheet of paper like this every time, but this is basically the way that it goes. The first question I ask is, do I need to rivet or rescribe? And that's a pretty simple yes or no. And if the answer is yes, then the answer is immediately sprue goo. Okay, now for those of you that aren't familiar, what is sprue goo? It's this stuff right here. All right, it is a mixture of old sprue and Tamiya extra thin. Now, can you use other solvent welding cements like 10X or just straight mk? I'm sure you could, but all I know is it works well with extra thin. And so when I get down to where I've got like a half a bottle left, that's where I might think about making some. And all you have to do is chop up a bunch of chunks of your favorite sprue and put it in there. Now, what kind of sprue should you use? Well, I personally prefer Tamiya and Hasegawa plastic because it's pretty hard and it finishes well, and that's what I want out of sprue goo. There are people who talk about using evergreen, and you really don't want to do that. Evergreen is the least pure sprue out there. The native form of polystyrene is actually clear, and it's really hard and brittle, and the modifiers are what make it soft and flexible, which is if you've worked with evergreen that's what it's like. So I use good hard sprue because when you put this stuff down, the advantage of it is that it's styrene and it's going to behave just like polystyrene for the most part. So if you need to rescribe or re-rivet or file it or sand it or whatever, it's nice because it acts just like the native plastic. And it bonds really well to the native plastic. It just welds itself on there. So that's why I would choose to use it. And when you mix it, again, that's why I choose to use the type of styrene that I do. How much extra thin should you put in? Well, what you want is for it to be kind of like honey or pancake syrup, and you want to thin it until it stops being stringy, because you can see that those strings can get to be a bit of a hassle. And this is actually maybe still a little bit too thick. Now, why is mine green? I add a little bit of green lacquer paint to it so that it's easier to see when it's on gray plastic. All right, so this is my favorite filler material, and I'll use it in most cases, sometimes even if I don't have to do any scribing or riveting, but definitely if I do. Now, what's the disadvantage? Well, it takes longer to dry. There are people who say it takes forever. That's not true. I've worked it in as little as 8 hours, but definitely by the next day, as long as you're not just really piling it on, then you should be good to go. One other disadvantage is that it can sometimes shrink up a little bit over time. So you want to make sure that you don't have any ghost seams before you move on to the next step. All right, so that's that decision. Now, what if the answer is no? Don't need to rescribe or re-rivet. All right, the next question is, can I sand the part? All right, because there are situations where you can't or you don't want to. All right, so a situation where you can't is one where like you just might not be able to get to it, right? Or because you've got detail there that will be obscure or erased if you start doing a bunch of sanding. A good example is like a figure. If you're attaching an arm to the shoulder on a figure and it's got the wrinkles in the clothing or whatever, you just may not be able to sand there, or at least not do it effectively. So if you can't sand and the answer is no, then you go over here to what I call the wet removal method. All right. And what that means is that instead of sanding to dress the filler down, you're going to remove it with a solvent. Okay, so that means using something like Mr. Surfacer 500, and what happens there is that when you put Mr. Surfacer 500 down and you let it dry, and it does take a little bit. It's one reason that I don't use it when I have to do any sanding. Mr. Surfacer also tends to be a little soft and doesn't sand as well as other lacquer-based fillers. But it will, you can remove it with a Q-tip soaked in IPA or a mild lacquer thinner like Tamiya lacquer thinner. In fact, that's pretty much the only reason why I keep Tamiya lacquer thinner around, is because when I want to do that wet removal method, I just dip a Q-tip in here and then I use it to scrub away the excess Mr. Surfacer, and that leaves some of it only inside the joint that I'm trying to fill. Now, that's a pretty quick and easy method, but the disadvantage is that it will also probably leave a little bit of a telltale. So, if you want to sort of reduce the visibility of a panel line, for example, this is the wet removal method is pretty good, because you probably are not going to just completely, it's probably not going to completely go away, and you can kind of control that such that you've got a little bit of a panel line left. It's just kind of a judgment call. Other places where I've used this method are like next to a clear part where I don't want to do any sanding, or I can't get to it, because you can, for the most part, you can use even Tamiya lacquer thinner, as long as you don't get really crazy, to clean Mr. Surfacer off of a clear part without screwing it up. So that's the wet removal method. You can also do that method using things like Abe's Epoxy Sculpt, which is great. If you're not familiar with that, it's a 2-part epoxy putty with a metallic filler. They have a version called Epoxy Clay that does not have metallic filler. This stuff, when you blend the two parts together, gives you, it gives you hours really to work it, and you can work it with water. Like you can use a wet paintbrush or a wet Q-tip or a wet finger or whatever. Milliput, green stuff, they are all pretty much the same kind of thing. Tamiya has a two-part epoxy putty that's a lot like that. You can use that as well. You can also, if you really must, use a water-based filler like what's the stuff called? I've like purged it from my memory because I hate it so much. Perfect Plastic Putty. Vallejo also makes a water-based putty that's basically like bathroom caulk. I don't like either one of them. They don't bond to plastic. They don't sand well. They don't provide a good finish. I just don't use them unless I have a really weird situation. And there's always the exception. But anyway, that's the wet removal method. I don't want to use that here because I do want to get rid of that joint altogether, and there's no problem with sanding that. There's not going to be any scribing or anything like that involved. So I want to sand it, but I don't really need the very best surface finish, and I don't really, I don't really want to have to work any harder than necessary. But regardless, I'm going to use a lacquer putty, and there are a bunch of those on the market. If you're familiar with Squadron Green, that's lacquer putty. Tamiya makes a gray one and a white one that's lacquer based. I don't like either one of them. They're for one reason they're just way more expensive than is necessary for something that's just basically a really, really thick lacquer paint. And so I don't buy those. What I do buy is Bondo 907, and it's great because it is super cheap, and it's easy to find, at least in the United States. I know it's not as easy to find overseas, but there are similar products. Okay, you can go to your local auto body supply and just tell them that you need a single part glazing and spot putty. All right. A lot of automotive fillers are two-part, where you have to mix the filler with a hardener. This 907, you do not, okay? This stuff comes straight out of the tube, and it's ready to go. Now, another version of this is this stuff called Combi Spot Putty, all right? Now, why would I choose Combi over 907? They're both basically the same stuff, but it's like they're like kissing cousins, I suppose. This stuff is a little bit less, it's a little bit more porous. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why I don't like Squadron, because it is really porous. And when you go to paint over it, you'll see that. This stuff is a lot less porous than Squadron. This stuff is a lot less porous than the 907. So, if my surface finish is really going to be important, all right, if it's an external surface that's going to get looked at, and I've got a situation where I need to really be able to sand it smooth and feather it out, no scribing, no riveting, I'm going to use this Combi. It's really good stuff. Now, what about super glue? I'm sure some of you are asking, why not super glue or super glue mixed with some kind of filler like acrylic powder, baking soda, sand, whatever. Yeah, I know. There are a lot of people who swear by super glue as a filler, and you can certainly use it, but I hate it because invariably I find that it's rock hard and it's difficult to sand. It's much harder, for example, than styrene, and that's going to show up. Assuming you can put up with it being really hard to sand, you're going to see that the surrounding material is going to be affected more, and that can result in a less than satisfactory appearance to your bodywork. Now, I did use it the other day when I did that little operation on the side of this set of air tanks, and there were a couple sort of caveats to that. One is I was using the extra thin CA, and in a very small amount, and I sanded it within like 15 or 20 minutes. So for whatever reason, I don't think super glue gets really, really hard for a little while. How long exactly, I don't know. But I have found that if you get after it right away, it's not too bad. But again, that was just plain super glue without anything added to it. So that's kind of my position on that. The only time that I will use super glue and what I use is acrylic nail powder as a filler is when I need to fill something huge and it needs to be super, super strong. Like, you know, on the inside of a fuselage, if I didn't feel like that the joint in here was going to be strong enough, then I might mix up some super glue and nail powder and put it in there and then use Kicker to cure it. I mean, it'll make a really, really strong joint. But at that point, it's almost not like you're using it as a filler. You're using it more as a material to actually to build up the structure of a thing. So anyway, that's kind of the decision-making process I go through. I hope that makes sense, and that is why I've got this tube of 907 out, if I can keep from throwing it on the floor. So let's just get down to doing the actual filling, and I will show you yet another thing that I do with this stuff. I watch, you know, I watch videos, or I see, you know, people posting their work in process online, and they've got massive amounts of filler on a small joint, and it just makes me cringe, makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up on end, because it's just so unnecessary. I mean, I've said this before. One of my rules is do the least work necessary. Touch the parts the least amount necessary. So I don't ever want to apply too much of anything. I don't want too much glue. That's one I'm pretty bad about. I don't want too much filler. I don't want too much primer. I don't want too much paint. Just as much as is necessary. So I've got this right here, and I could, you know, find myself some kind of a, you know, thing like this. You know, once I get it stirred up, because you can see that it's got some of the solvent that has separated. I mean, that's, you know, that's pretty nice and thin, and I could, you know, take this, and I could go in here, and I could start kind of just smearing it on there, and you know, and that gets it into the thing. And you know, of course, I'm going to sand it down, right? So does it really matter how much extra I use? Well, again, yeah, because especially if this is an area where the appearance matters, well, all that extra sanding that I've got to do now to clean that excess up, not only is it just more work that I really don't want to do, but it's going to cause me more disturbance of the original surface, and that increases the odds that I'm going to have a flaw. I mean, it's just that simple. So what do we do about that? All right, well, this is easy. Okay, so lacquer thinner, just cheapo hardware store lacquer thinner. All right, and I'm going to just add a little bit there. You know, it's just a matter of feel as to how much. All right, and I'm going to just stir it up, and I'm just going to use this shitty paintbrush. And you can use as big or small of a paintbrush as you want. I mean, you can use a tiny, tiny, tiny paintbrush and apply a very tiny amount of filler. Because now you've got the ultimate in control, where you can just apply only as much as is necessary. And also now, because the stuff is a little more liquid, it will naturally fill that joint you don't have to worry about smearing it or smashing it down in there to get a good fill. And now you've got a really nice, neat job of it. All right. Now, as the lacquer thinner evaporates, which is going to happen pretty quickly, that's the thing with lacquer-based fillers. They start drying up pretty quick. I mean, you should be able to sand this stuff within half an hour for the most part. But as it starts to thicken up, to dry and thicken up, it gets harder and messier to work. Like you can see over here, right? You can see it's stiffening up already, and now it becomes more difficult to get it to cooperate and go where I want it to. So as that starts to happen, you may notice that it's shrinking down into the joint, and that's fine. That's to be expected, and all you do is go back and add another layer. Not a big deal. So once we got that done, go back and look at the other one, and you can see, yep, you can see where it is starting to shrink down in there a little bit. And so just go back and add a little bit more. And really it shouldn't take more than a couple applications. And if you're careful to not disturb what you've already done, then you should be able to pile enough on there to get a good fill that will sand down flush. Okay? Now, look at how much less work I'm going to do and how much less disturbance I'm going to create by sanding that bead of filler down than I would if it all looked like that garbage over there on the right. Okay? So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to make sure that I've got enough on here, and I'm going to let this dry for about half an hour, and then come back and we'll sand that out and see how it all looks. Okay, so it's a little while later, not quite an hour maybe, and you can see that I cleaned out this brush with just cheap lacquer thinner, and it's all good. It's that easy, and you can see, you know, that stuff is almost all completely dry. I went ahead and sanded this one out, and you can see I wasn't real super careful about it, because obviously you don't have to be in that situation. But what I did was I just took this 240 grit UMP thinning stick. I like them for this kind of thing because they're nice and flexible, and just put a little bit of water on it, and this knocks down pretty quickly. Anyway, after I sand that off with the 240 grit sanding stick, then I come back with this 400 grit thinning stick, and it's all good. So once I get the other one done, I'll shoot some primer on both of them. We'll come back and take a look before we spray some color coat. Okay, so here we are back again, and I've done some work off camera that I want to explain. And you can kind of see here what's going on. If you are sharp-eyed, you'll see that there's what appears to be some black filler material on top of this seam. So let me explain why I did that first of all, then I'll explain what I used, because that's a little bit longer of an explanation. Okay, the reason that I did that, all right, it's pretty much impossible anytime you start doing body work to get your surface back to exactly as good as virgin styrene. Now, when I say pretty much impossible, it's actually totally impossible, just depending on how, fine of a scratch you want to talk about. But all you really have to do is get it back enough that it looks good in paint, right? And that's entirely possible. But it does require some work because you have disturbed the surface. Either because of your, sanding or scraping or filing or whatever you've done, that's going to obviously leave micro scratches in the surrounding plastic. But the joint itself is what I want to talk about. The material that you use, even if you're using sprue goo, which is obviously native, pretty close to native styrene, the surface that you're going to get from your filler material itself is going to be different. It may have a different texture. It may absorb paint differently. It may shrink a little bit. This is where we get into discussing the evil ghost seam. Now, ghost seams, we could probably occupy a whole video about just those, but that's where basically you fill and sand and paint and there's still some evidence of the seam there. And you fill and sand and paint and it's still there. And you just, rinse and repeat and and it's like it just won't go away. It's like it's haunted, right? So we call them ghost seams. Now, there are theories about what causes ghost seams. I don't think that it's one single thing. I think that they sometimes actually are there because the material has continued to shrink over time. And that can happen, with something like sprue goo. But I think that it gets attributed to that more often than it actually is. I think more often it's because of differential sanding, where the material in the joint is either harder or softer than the surrounding material, and it just doesn't sand the same. If it's a softer material inside the joint, it may end up being a little bit shallower, and now it shows as a slight little ditch there when you put paint on it. So what do you do about that? Well, there's a couple of things, but in this case, because we've used a lacquer based filler that, even though it's pretty good, still has some porosity to it, the bottom line is that I want to seal it and kind of make sure that the color coat is not going to be able to soak into it. And sometimes that can happen even after you put a layer of primer on it, especially if you're using similar material primer. So let's say that I am using a lacquer filler and I use a lacquer primer, and then I put a lacquer color coat on top of it. Now, if that lacquer color coat is a little hotter than everything underneath it, it may sort of reactivate the joint and you may see some texture kind of showing up. So what I try to do is just get the thing sealed and smooth before I put my final layer of primer on it. And what I'm using for that in this case, there are different, people will talk about using different things. One thing people like to use is the aforementioned Stynylrez, because it's an acrylic primer, and so it should, at least in theory, not get reactivated by subsequent applications of lacquer. And it's a good theory. It works. And you could spray some on a joint, you can brush it on a joint, whatever the case may be, you're going to sand it down, so it doesn't really matter, and you just really want it to be quick and efficient. But what I prefer to use is this, all right? This is a bottle of some grody old all-clad 309 microfiller primer. And the reason that it ended up in this bottle as my spot sealer of choice is because I hate it. Let me explain. I used to use this all-clad 309 as my go-to spray-on primer. It was wonderful. I loved it until the day I didn't. And that was because I sprayed it on a model, and it looked like gravel. And I thought it was something I had done. So I stripped it all off, which was not an easy thing to do because this is very hot and it etches the plastic. So I stripped it all off and shot it again, and looked like gravel. So then I was starting to get pissed. So then I sprayed it on a completely different piece of virgin plastic, and it looked like gravel. Got to looking around on the internet and discovered that other people had had the same problem. And basically the theory is that the microfiller starts to agglomerate and turn into chunks that don't break down enough to give you a smooth finish anymore. And it can happen just whenever. Like this bottle was good one day, and a month later, not good. So I don't have any room on my workbench for stuff that works most of the time. I'm not gambling my time and effort and energy on products that may or may not work, even if, you know, they may work 90% of the time. So I'll never trust that primer as a spray primer again, and that's when I moved over to Mr. Surfacer 1500. But it's pretty thick and it's really hot, and with it in a handy little brush bottle like this, it's wonderful for painting onto a joint. It dries within about 30 minutes and it sands down really hard. I mean, it's not hard to sand. I mean that it's a hard material that'll sand down really dry like a good lacquer primer should. And you can see what I'm talking about with that joint reactivation, because it has soaked on down in there, and you can see where the lacquer filler was, right? It's shrunk the whole thing down. Now, that doesn't mean it's not going to sand down flush at this point, but this is a perfect illustration of what I'm talking about with the reactivation of a ghost seam. And I may have to do another application of that, but we'll see. In this case, you can see that it sanded down really nice and flush. At least it looks, I think it is. You know, I revealed some of the filler, and so that may show. I don't know. We'll see. Now, this is why I use this particular material, and it works so good that when my supply of this old stuff is gone, you know, in 5 years, because I don't really have to use it very often, I will honestly probably buy another bottle of All Clad 309 just to use for this, because it does work so well for me. Some people will say, you know, use that or use extra thin super glue. I've done that as well, but again, that's my go-to solution for this. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just put a little water down here, and I'm going to get busy sanding this. Same sanding sticks that I was using before, and I'm going to just knock that out. But actually, before I do that, I want to point out one thing that I almost forgot about. So let me get a pointer here, because if you look right here in the joint, okay, all right, you'll notice this, a sort of cancerous looking spot, and there's another one over here. So this was a weird deal, because I found that when I went to sand the 907, that both of those spots were gummy. And this was like 30 minutes to an hour after I had applied the Bondo, and it should have been fine. But those spots were kind of gummy. And they, even last night, like 4 or 5 hours later, they were still a little bit gummy. And the only explanation I have, they seem hard now, the only explanation that I have, because I think that there, if I remember right, that's where the gates were. And here's what happens, and this is another reason, another thing that can cause ghost seams to appear, in fact, where there never was a seam in the first place. And that is sort of differential density or differing material properties at locations of importance in the mold flow. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, you've got plastic squirting into the cavity where those gates are attached. And as that cools, it may have different material properties. And that's what caused those spots to react differently to the lacquer filler that I put on there. I've seen situations where you have a flow front in a mold, and this happens with car bodies, where basically you've got gates on each side of a part. The material flows toward the middle, and you get a front where the flow from the one side meets the flow from the other side, and it cools a little bit differently. It gives you a little bit different material properties. And even though there was no joint or parting line or anything there in the first place, it ends up getting sort of reactivated by a hot primer. This happens a lot with in the car modeling world with zero paints, because they are so freaking hot. And you end up with what looks like a ghost seam, and you're like, what the hell? I never did any body work there in the first place. And so again, you have to figure out some kind of a barrier. And in the case of like the car modeling guys with using really hot automotive lacquers for their color coats, the solution that seems most popular is to use an acrylic primer like Stynylrez as the so that you've got an inert barrier. So at any rate, it's something that has to be dealt with, and that's what I'm doing right now. So I'm gonna just get this knocked out, and I'm gonna shoot a little bit of primer on it, and we'll come back and have a look at it when that's all said and done. Okay, so I just shot the primer, and this is great. I'm becoming more and more glad that even though I personally didn't really feel like I was going to worry about this joint, that I decided to do it as a demonstration exercise, because this is showing several phenomenon that are really frustrating for a lot of model makers. Okay, first of all, if you were looking before, you may have noticed that I did not do the sealing step on the Bondo that was right back here, and you can see how much it shows. There's our ghost seam captured live and on camera right there, and you can see how bad it is. Now, is that because the material shrank, because it was softer, it sanded deeper? I don't know. It doesn't matter, right? It's there, and you got to deal with it. Now, you can see here that we still have a little bit of a ghost here. And you may have seen when I was spraying it that I could see that as I was spraying. So I really hosed it on in that area to give me a little more sanding meat. You can also see the primer diagnosis effect here. This is showing a little bit right here in this area because I just didn't get it sanded down flush right there. And so there's a little bit of a ridge showing, okay? And these are things that might not really show up that bad by the time you put the color coat on and you spray some ungloss and all that. But especially if you're doing a metallic finish, it is definitely, a possibility that it will show. And just, again, why take the chance? Now, you can also see right here, this is the dusting thing that I have talked about. Because I was really concentrating my spray in this area, I had a lot of paint particles just bouncing around and dropping on this surface, and you can see how dusty looking that is. Now, in some cases with that dusting thing, you can just polish it off with a piece of cloth or a Q-tip, because it's not really, stuck to the surface. But sometimes it is, and you'll figure it out pretty quickly. And if it is, then, you got to sand it down. If you can't get in there with sandpaper, another trick is to spray some straight Mr. Leveling thinner on it. And that'll basically melt those little particles and flatten them out. And you can see there, I was able to wipe most of it off. And it'll be gone by the time we're done with the next round of sanding, which I'm going to do here in just a little bit. But right here, you can see on the other side, not good at all. That side, you can really see it right here like this when you get a hard enough angle on the view. I mean, that joint looks like ass. And again, you can see that the direction that you look at it makes a big difference, because from right here, looking at it side on, you can see how bad it is. Look at it from straight overhead and you're like, yeah, I don't see anything at all, right? So, again, this is just another, there, look how bad that is with that side light coming in from my big window. This is why I feel like the inspection portion of any operation is one of the single most important things, because that will look absolutely horrible with a metallic color coat on top of it. It's just not acceptable. So yeah, I'll deal with that. Okay, so it's about an hour later and I sanded these out and I think they look pretty good. Now, will they still look good when we put the color coat on top of it, especially given that it's going to be metallic? I don't know. I'm not 100% confident. This is what happens with ghost seams. You get everything looking pretty tasty, and then you shoot a color coat, and bam, suddenly you can see that seam again. I also have still got some micro scratches in there that I would almost guarantee will show up. And so this is a good point to talk about the discipline of doing good body work, because honestly, we're just not going to get a whole lot of it on this kit. So let me talk about how I did this sanding work. You can see right here, I've got these sanding sponges laid out. The first thing I did was go at it with this bit of sponge, and I wet sanded that. And this is a pretty aggressive little piece of sponge. I think this is 400 grit, but I'm not certain. And this illustrates a point that is really important. I forgot to write the grit on the back of this piece of sponge that I cut off here. So I honestly can't remember. And I, quite frankly, can't tell just by looking at it. It looks like it's probably 400 to me, but I don't trust my eye on that. And that's one reason why I love the fact that these Infini sticks are clearly labeled. And a lot of people are like, oh, you don't really need the grit. You just do it by feel and just do it by eye. Yeah, whatever. I don't trust that at all. I would not put money on myself, looking at these blind to be able to tell which one was 800 and which one was 600. I mean, yeah, again, it may not matter to you, but I really believe in being disciplined when it comes to sanding, because what happens is if you skip a grit or you jump too far, that's when you get those micro scratches. You see those kind of on the left of that shiny area? Those are leftover scratches from one of the heavier grits that I didn't get taken out in my progression. And those are the things that will really screw you up when it comes to a finish that really, really matters, like a metallic finish or a glossy finish. Especially if you're polishing out a clear coat, for example. The only thing for it is to go back down to the heavier grit, go crossways, and then work back up in your progression, and hope that you're not being heavy-handed and that your abrasives are high quality and don't have a lot of random sized boulders in them. That's the stuff that all figures in there, and it matters. It's frustrating, having to keep going back and redoing it and repriming it and resanding it, but look, it is what it is. World-class effort takes world-class results take world-class effort. That's just the bottom line. And so you just have to be willing to spend the time. It all comes down to how bad you really want it to look good. So we'll see. I'm going to go ahead and shoot some some color on these right now, and we'll just see. We'll just see if if it comes up looking good enough. The last step that I did on these was I just got in there with this piece of 4/0 steel wool, which is really handy in places like this where you've got a contour and it's kind of hard to get in there with sanding paper. I equate 4/0 steel wool with being something like 1,000 to 1,200 grit. I don't know if there's any science behind that, but that's just kind of how it feels to me. Okay, so apparently I've let myself run out of MRP Super Silver, which is my go-to for basic bare aluminum. But this MRP Silver is pretty close, and honestly, this is a situation where I don't have to be super picky because, again, it's a situation that just is not going to be very visible. I have just found over time that when I really get to looking at the subtleties of the tone and the amount of brilliance, luster, some people call it, that super silver is what I like, and I can't believe that I allowed myself to run out of it. So I'm gonna have to hit up Matt Bowl at Hobby World USA, because that is where I get all of my MRP and most of my stuff. So I've got my air pressure turned back down to about 15 psi. Again, that's not a magic number, but it's a number that I stick with because of that ABCs of painting thing. Always be consistent. In that interest, I also prefer to never mix in the cup, and that's where things like pipettes come in. And I definitely do not pour straight out of the bottle. I mean, come on, we are not barbarians around here. Just dripped some on my bench. That's annoying, but this cutting mat is due for replacement anyway. That's like an annual ritual that I have, and it's about time to do that. So, got some MRP in the cup. And again, I would definitely normally be spraying this in the spray booth, but can't really do that effectively and demonstrate on camera. Now, the Spitfire, the interior is bare aluminum, depending on what mark you're looking at, from about right here at that former that's directly behind the seat on back. So that's what we're going to be spraying. And so I'm going to just start with a light coat. And this is a good time to talk about sort of the philosophy of spraying metallics, if you want to call it that. There's a belief out there that you want to spray metallics, you know, just mist them on and have it be really thin, and I disagree with that almost all the time. And here's why. Because you can see kind of how in the variation of my spraying there that I have some that's heavier and lighter, and that's just, you know, because I'm just not doing a great job with my spray discipline. But where it's sprayed really light and misted on, it looks like shit because it's so grainy. And I think that this is the most common mistake that I see with metallics, is people just not spraying it on heavily enough. I'm not necessarily going to not necessarily going to advocate hosing it on, especially where we might be, you know, in danger of a relatively hot lacquer activating a ghost seam. which this is kind of a little experiment for. But I am going to advocate putting it on plenty thick and spraying it wet, you know, or at least close to wet. Because again, I don't want to see grains, I don't want to see particles, I don't want to see pigments. I want to see something that is as close to a smooth sheet of aluminum as I can get. And so that's how I'm gonna spray. Now, this is also a good example of situational awareness and watching, you know, what's happening and taking care of crap as soon as you see it. And there is some crap. See right there, I've got that bit of flurm on that rib right there. As soon as I spot that, okay, I'm not screwing around, all right? I'm going to immediately grab this 400 grit thinny stick, and this is one of the wonderful things about using lacquers. I mean, that stuff is already really just about dry enough to be sanded, and I'm going to just go in there and I'm going to just hopefully knock that off. It shouldn't take much. I mean, it's just a little fleck of dust or something, and hopefully that's enough. You don't want to do too much because, again, I'm not trying to create more work for myself, but I'm pleased to see that, you know, the ghost seam is not showing up. But you can see what I mean if you really, I don't know if you'll be able to see it on camera because it's metallic and it's hard, but look, you can see some of those micro scratches that I predicted would show up, and sure enough, there they are. Now, I don't have to worry about that again because this is a situation of very limited visibility. But you see my point, hopefully, in that if this were not limited visibility, if this was on the outside of the model and it was really important, then I would be upset because I would have to fix that. So here we go, just with a third layer. And with MRP, I find that 3 layers is kind of the magic number for full coverage, 100% opacity, full density, whatever you want to call it. And so I'm gonna stop there. I think that's going to be just fine. That's a pretty decent finish in there, especially, again, considering how much it's going to show. Let's do the other side and see how we feel about that. Hopefully it will look just as good. One thing, I used that steel wool. If you're going to use it, you have to be really careful about cleaning out any little flecks of it, because it definitely will leave little bits and pieces of itself. Okay, so there we go. That's a nice first layer. And you can already see there's a little divot, a little pinhole in that area where I talked about the plastic being softer because of the, I think where the gate was. And, you know, that's just the deal with metallics. They are going to show every single imperfection and flaw in your finishing work. And so this, again, I may have mentioned it before. I'm not going to apologize for mentioning it over and over again, but this is where really strong light and using an optivisor is really important. I am wearing an optivisor pretty much all the time. I'm not right now, but especially when I'm doing finishing work, I am using an optivisor. It's just critical that you have good visibility when you're evaluating your progress. Okay, so there we go. That's that one. And now all I have to do is deal with the... there's some other places where I have to spray some of this. So I'm going to go ahead and get on with that. But I think we're going to call it good on this, this segment, because that's kind of the project milestone that I wanted to get to with this. And you can see, oh, there, look, a little bit of flurm right there on that rib. Don't know if that's the same one I was chasing around and it just moved or what. But let's just fix that right now. So, Optivisor on. This time, I'm going to get a little bit more aggressive, and I'm going to grab a blade. Whoops. And really take a look at that. And I'm going to reach in there and just very carefully. Bottom line is, I didn't do a good job of getting rid of it before, and so now I'm paying the price. And you know, you have to be careful. You can do this kind of stuff pretty quickly with lacquers, but once you get built up to that third layer, it's not drying as completely, and you may not be able to get away with it. The other thing is, yep, and sure enough, man, that looks terrible. That looks terrible. So I've got a goober there. I've got a divot in that, and that is in an area that I would consider, well, maybe not. Maybe it won't show because the oxygen tank is going to cover that up. Yay, I think I'm good. I think the oxygen tank is going to rescue me right there, but you can see what I'm saying. It is definitely visible, and again, if this was an area that really mattered, I'd have to let the paint cure out enough to where I could sand that out and fix it. That's just the way it goes. So anyway, I'm going to move on and finish the rest of this. Okay, let's take a quick look at these and get this segment over already. I just wanted to show you a couple of things. Okay, I was talking about how, you know, sometimes you try to make things better and they just get worse. Well, another good illustration of that. So I could not resist trying to get rid of that little goober. And so I tried sanding in there a little bit. Could not really get up next to that rib as easily as I wanted to. So I did a trick that I'm hesitant to tell you about, but it is effective. Sometimes the best thing to do is just stop trying and remove the paint altogether. And you can do that with lacquers in a small area, especially where it's kind of contained within some features like that. And sometimes you can get away with it. Basically all I did was I just dipped the point of this Q-tip in some lacquer thinner and went in there and scrubbed that paint off and then immediately resprayed it. And it's not too bad. I mean, you know, it's a little better than having a goober sticking out of there, but you can still tell that it's not quite right. And I promise you that in other circumstances, I would be either sanding that some more or stripping it off or, you know, doing whatever I had to redo it. But not going to in this case, because I need to move on. Let's look at this one, because this also is giving me a good sort of teaching opportunity that I didn't expect. Take a look at this right here, okay? This side of the fuselage is apparently cursed because the ghost seam from where I did the work is not so bad. But look at that sort of rough looking area right there. Okay, that basically is crazing. And That will sometimes happen with lacquers. You know, that's just their nature. They're hot. But you can see that there's some patterns there. Like there's, you know, there's also some of it on the fuselage part back there behind the joint. That's a pretty good view of it. Okay, that's what I was talking about with mold flow and different material properties that are caused by you know, heat transfer and fluid dynamics and all that. And there's just really nothing you can do about that. If it happens, it happens. But the good news is that I really only see this happen a lot, at least with MRP, with metallics. I don't know if the metallics in this product line are just a little hotter or what, but I will occasionally see it happen. And the truth is, there's really nothing for it. You just have to sand it and fix it if that is in fact necessary. But again, going back to something I said before, I might have been able to avoid all of this by just using an acrylic primer as opposed to using a lacquer primer. That's just a decision you have to make. So I think we've had a good enough look at all of the finishing work on this and what it takes to get it done, and you know, we can see the results, and for my purposes, these are good enough. We are going to move forward. Okay, so there you go. Hopefully you can see why I thought that was important. That just gets into some really nitty-gritty fundamental stuff about doing body work, and it's a thing. It's not as much of a thing with a Tamiya kit, and so I kind of had to take the opportunity there on the inside of the thing to demonstrate that. But I think that was good stuff. It showed some things that get talked about a lot. And for the record, yeah, when I went through this and rewatched it to do the editing, I could still see goobers. And for the record, I did go back and fix this. I just can't help myself. I'm super compulsive for one thing, but I also kind of look at it as kind of like in the same way that I look at exercise or working out. Sometimes you just do it to keep your skills sharp, you know, convince yourself you can, you know, practice, whatever you want to call it, all of that. Sometimes I just do those things because that's just never a bad thing. So at any rate, the next episode, so I'm going to try something different. I've been getting lots of good questions along the way here, and I'm terrible about answering questions on the actual channel page, the video page. So what I'm going to do is, on the next episode, I'm going to take up as much of that one as necessary, even if it's the whole episode, to just do Q&A. So I'll address the questions that I've gotten so far, and if there's some new ones, then I'll try and pick those up as well. So if you got questions you want me to talk about on video, then get those in the comments, and I'll try and do my best to give you good answers. All right, as always, I appreciate you guys watching. Much love.